Hello everyone. In this presentation, I'm going to start at the most basic level and explain what archival material is and an outline of what this class will cover. So records have a life cycle that includes their creation, their active use, and their inactive use. This model is called the life cycle model and was created in the late 1930s by some employees at the National Archives. Records are usually maintained by the creator through the creation and active use phase, and then maintained by either the creator, creating institution, or a records manager during the inactive phase. The last part is where the archivist comes in. As an archivist, you'll be one of the people that looks at records and decides if they need to be maintained for legal purposes or should be retained for historical reasons, or if they should be disposed of. We'll talk in a later lesson about how these decisions are made. As an example of a record's life cycle, Coast Guard logbooks at the National Archives were created to document the daily activities of Coast Guard vessels. They are maintained for 1 year after the last date for review by Coast Guard inspectors. They are then moved to a federal records center for 30 years where they can be accessed by the Coast Guard and the public. These have been determined to have historical value and are, after 30 years, transferred to the National Archive. When you hear the term archives, it can refer to many different types of things, including the non-current groups of records, such as the Coast Guard logbooks, a building where archives are stored, for example, archival storage, or an organization, program, or agency that is responsible for managing historical records, like the National Archive. You may also hear the term manuscripts. This refers to unpublished records, such as diaries, letters, minutes, or speeches. So for the purpose of this course, I will most likely use the term archives to describe manuscript collections. You may sometimes see distinctions between libraries, archives, and museums, but these have always been ambiguous. The reality is that you're going to have books, artifacts, objects, historical records in your archive collection. The main difference to keep in mind is that libraries generally have circulating materials that can be borrowed by the public. Archives and museums do not have circulating material. Museums are historically curator driven and usually only provide access to limited holdings through exhibit or educational interpretation. Archives tend to be research driven and are accessible by appointment in non public spaces. Access to collections online have changed some of this, but the roles of these institutions has been blurred a bit, but we'll talk about that in a later lesson. So say you want to start an archival program. Maybe you have a company and you have an upcoming anniversary, or it's been brought to your attention that you have records that offer a glimpse into your company's history, and you want to save that history. Or say you recognize that your local community is being underserved in a particular area and you'd like to open an archive. Say, for example, you live in Austin, Texas, and think that the music history of the area could be celebrated by creating an archive dedicated to the history of the local music heritage. Or you live in New York and realize there's no archive or museum dedicated to vaudeville, and this is where vaudeville was born in 1881. Then you need to know what goes into creating an archive. First off, you'll need to figure out what the collection theme or focus is. Remember that most archives are regional, so you want to focus on something that will serve your local community, whether that's your company's personnel or the local residents. Think through what time period you want to collect. If we were to collect material relating to vaudeville in New York, we would want to start at the beginning and not 40 years later. Determine why you should make the commitment to maintain this material. Are you the best person or group that can make this material available? If you work in a college that is focused on the arts, you might not want to start an archive dedicated to, say, criminal law. That wouldn't make sense. Think of who will use your collection. A museum and archives in New York City dedicated to the history of the subway system makes sense in New York City, but not in, say, Florida. People in New York will be interested in the history and will use the collection for research and education on a regular basis. Does your institution already have some of the records, and how are they being retained? You need to make a commitment to preserving the material for the long term, so you can't do this haphazardly. So also think about if the topic is something that is underrepresented in your community or is already being collected by another repository. Since there's already a museum and archive dedicated to the New York City subway system in New York, it would not make sense to open a second archive dedicated to the same topic. One thing we'll look at when we look at archive ethics in a later lesson is that archives should never compete with one another. So when starting an archive, it's important to have a mission statement and scope of collection. You want to make sure that you think through exactly what you want to focus on. You can't collect everything. For example, even the National Archives only collects about 3% of federal records created. Here's an example of a museum mission and scope. The Museum of the Moving Image collects material culture related to the art history and technology of the moving image. It does not collect actually moving image footage. In contrast, the UCLA Film and Television Archive collects exclusively film and television recordings. So archives are generally regionalized, and we'll talk a lot more about this. Most archives will focus on local history and collect the records of the local community, even though the National Archive has regional offices to make it easier for researchers to access their records. So what does an archivist do? An archivist is responsible for determining what to keep, physically acquiring the material, doing the paperwork to legally acquire the records, arranging and describing the records to make them accessible, ensuring that the records are preserved and made accessible by providing research and reference services, and by doing outreach through educational programs and online access. You need to ask some fundamental questions when acquiring new items for the collection so that you don't end up with items that you don't want. The archives is not a black hole that people can just store their records in. It has to fit within the mission and the scope, have historical value, not have too many restrictions or demands on the repository resources, and is useful to researchers. We'll talk about how to make these decisions later in this course. One of the earliest of the modern archival theorists was British archivist Sir Hilary Jenkins, probably best known to most of the world as one of the Monument Men. You may have seen the 2014 movie, The Monuments Men, that is loosely based on this group of experts in the field of art preservation that worked to track down and save artwork stolen by the Nazis in World War II. Jenkins has published a book in 1922 called Manual of Archive Administration that outlines these theories of archival work, including two elements that were his own: objectivity and the archivist as the custodian. We'll discuss this in more detail throughout the course, but there are some overreaching theories that archivists use in selecting and processing collections. These are a few of the big ones. They are that material should not be selected for preservation in a way that would rewrite history. You want to always maintain the provenance of the collection, even if this is just tracking the accession paperwork and describing the place of origin at the collection level. And you want to determine what the original order of the material is and try to maintain that. You want to make sure that when items are donated or purchased, there's legal paperwork, and that provides that it is now belongs to the archive. Excuse me. You do not want to get into a situation where your legal ownership of something in your collection is brought into question. Also, you cannot just store your archives in any location. You need to commit to maintaining a constant, moderate environment that is best for the types of records that you're preserving. Processing is another topic we'll cover in detail. That includes arranging a collection to make it accessible, taking action to preserve the material, and creating descriptions that describe what's in the records. We'll also talk about identifying preservation concerns and how to deal with them. We'll also discuss the various ways to document and share the archive collections, from traditional finding aids and catalogs to more innovative online exhibits, social media, and sharing collections through things like APIs. So making records accessible to the public is a big part of being an archivist. Caring for the records of your institution is a full-time job. But digging through the collection and pulling data out is a job that researchers should handle in most instances. When you see a movie set in an earlier time period with like the costume designers, writers, set designers, directors, they usually will refer to archival material to create the environment that you see in the film. As an archivist, again, you're responsible for providing this data to researchers. And this is an example of a large data project that's currently underway. So when you hear things today like today was the hottest day in 140 years, you may ask, like, what is it hotter on this day 141 years ago? No, it's because not all the climate records out there have been digitized and compiled into a usable form, and researchers are still tracking that data down. In Uzbekistan, they have preserved hydrometeorological observations since 1867. As of February 2020, they have converted over 7 million pages of these observations for climate scientists to research. In this course, we'll look at collections and a lot of different types of archives. There are two main types of archives: institutional repositories that collect based on a parent organization. For example, the Brooklyn Navy Yard has an archive dedicated to the history of the yard. There's also standalone repositories that collect a particular topic, such as the Archives of American Art or the New York Historical Society. In some cases, you'll see archives that are both. A lot of school collections will collect records of the school as well as special collections that represent the community. As you can see from the slide, at Stanford University, they have a special collection that includes an emphasis on the local area in California and Mexican American history. Government archives are repositories that collect materials relating to local, state, and national government entities. We'll closely look at the difference between these, things like federal, state, county, and city archives and what they collect and how to research them. There are currently about 4,000 historical societies in the United States. Many of them are focused on the history of a particular region, historical period, or subject. Although this course is focused on archives, many museums have archival collections, so that we'll include them in our umbrella. I actually initially went to library school almost 20 years ago because I wanted to work in museums. Many of the skills you'll learn about archival selection, preservation, documentation, outreach can be applied to museum collections. There are hundreds of religious denominations and hundreds of thousands of congregations, and many religious organizations have historically kept records of their faith, and as well as some vital records such as local birth and death. Community archives have become more prevalent and are usually created by communities that feel underrepresented. We'll talk about that. Most public libraries have some sort of archival collection. As you'll see in the history lecture, there was a lack of local, state, and federal archives, especially in the United States. So a lot of collections of manuscripts, maps, photographs, ephemera, prints were often deposited with libraries. There are also other types of business, nonprofit, hospitals, unions that have archives. Many of these are often institutionally focused and not always available to the public. So that's it for the first introductory lecture. In the next talk, I'll briefly go over the history of archives, especially as it pertains to the United States. So I will talk to you then.